Few people remember the biblical account of Joseph's death in Egypt. Joseph was probably one of the only biblical characters to have his body mummified and placed in an Egyptian sarcophagus. Surprisingly, his body remained for centuries without being buried in the place he so longed for, until it was finally taken from Egypt and carried for hundreds of kilometers over many years in the desert. But for a man who once held the second highest position in the entire Egyptian nation, was it really necessary for his bones to be transported to a distant land? What motivated his family to keep his body mummified for so long, waiting for the exact moment to fulfill his final wish? That is exactly what we will talk about in this video. Joseph is one of the central characters in the book of Genesis and plays a key role in the unfolding biblical story of the patriarchs. The biblical text records that Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob and, from a young age, was the target of great jealousy from his brothers. This occurred due to the dreams that distinguished him and the special favor his father showed him. Because of this troubled family environment, Joseph was sold by his own brothers to a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants, ending up in Egypt, where his story took surprising turns. During his time in Egypt, Joseph faced various trials. First, he served in the house of Potiphar, but was unjustly accused and imprisoned. However, Joseph always demonstrated faithfulness and integrity. The biblical narrative records that, by divine guidance, Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, revealing the coming years of abundance, followed by years of famine. As a result, Joseph was immediately elevated to the position of the second most important man in Egypt and became the administrator of the entire food supply of that kingdom. When famine struck many regions, including Canaan, Jacob's family migrated to Egypt in search of provisions. In a dramatic reunion, Joseph, who had previously been rejected by his brothers, was now in a position to provide for all of them. The text records that Jacob's entire family settled in an Egyptian region that offered good conditions for raising livestock. Over the years, Joseph's father, Jacob, grew old and eventually died in Egypt. Joseph, with great honor and respect, took care of his burial in Canaan, obeying his father's express request. Shortly after Jacob's death, the book of Genesis gives considerable attention to Joseph's relationship with his brothers. Although they feared retaliation from Joseph, he showed mercy, reaffirming that God's sovereignty had led them all to that point of life preservation. It is in this context that the biblical narrative provides the last information about Joseph, now elderly, living in Egypt with his brothers and extended family. The text records that Joseph lived to see the children of his children, witnessing not only his grandchildren, but even his great-grandchildren. The final part of his life in the Bible ends with an impressive prophetic declaration about the future of the people of Israel, and with his instructions regarding his own remains. The Bible describes Joseph's death in the final part of Genesis 50 in a brief but meaningful way. The text notes that Joseph lived to be 110 years old, an age considered ideal according to the Egyptian mindset of the time, as archaeological studies and Egyptian sources indicate that 110 years symbolized a full and blessed life cycle. Before his death, Joseph consolidated peace with his brothers, reassuring them about their fears of possible revenge, and reaffirmed that the evil they had done to him was transformed into good by God's sovereign hand. This verse, which says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good," is one of the great highlights of Genesis chapter 50. It illustrates Joseph's conviction that divine purposes transcend human actions, even when those actions are marked by injustice and cruelty. Then Joseph made a prophetic declaration saying, "I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." This statement recalls the promise initially made to Abraham, recorded in Genesis 15, that his descendants would sojourn in a foreign land, but that in due time God would deliver them and lead them back to the promised land. Joseph expressed his firm commitment to this promise by requiring his brothers to swear to carry his bones when God's plan to deliver Israel from Egypt was fulfilled. The text concludes by stating that Joseph was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. This practice distinguished not only individuals of high political and social standing, but also reflected the techniques that the Egyptians mastered and applied to their important dead, such as embalming, which is well known in modern archaeology. This shows that the connection between Egyptian customs and Joseph's death is remarkable. Because he reached a position of prominence in the kingdom, Joseph received honors consistent with local culture, being mummified and placed in an Egyptian sarcophagus. According to archaeological evidence and historical records, mummification was considered a sophisticated art in Egypt, tied to beliefs in preserving the body for life after death. The scriptures confirm that Joseph, having a status almost equivalent to a member of royalty, as he was in practice the administrator of Egypt, would not have been treated with anything less than great reverence at the end of his life. Thus, Joseph's body was carefully prepared and stored, awaiting ultimately the fulfillment of what he himself had prophesied when he declared, "God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land." In light of all this, it is safe to conclude that Joseph died of natural causes in peace in Egypt after a life full of days. After Joseph's death, the Bible mentions that the Israelites continued to live in Egypt. Initially, the presence of Jacob's descendants was marked by prosperity and good relationships with the Egyptian court, possibly extending for several generations. In fact, many historians and commentators suggest that Joseph rose to prominence during the Hyksos period, a Semitic people who ruled Egypt during the so-called Second Intermediate period, around the 17th century BC. However, this is not a consensus, as the biblical text does not directly mention the names of pharaohs. In any case, the book of Exodus states that a new king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. This dynastic transition meant a drastic change in policy regarding the Israelites. The memory of the benefits Joseph had brought to that kingdom seemed forgotten, and the sacred account points to the beginning of periods of harsh servitude and oppression over Jacob's descendants. This mention of a pharaoh who did not know Joseph, probably referring to a monarch from a new dynasty, symbolized the breaking of a tacit alliance, interrupting the initial warm reception the Israelite people had enjoyed. Exodus chapter 1 narrates how this pharaoh, fearing the numerical growth of the Israelites, began to subjugate and oppress that people, forcing them into heavy construction labor and servitude. This new socio-political reality in Egypt laid the historical foundations for the need for liberation narrated in the following chapters of Scripture, as well as the emergence of the figure of Moses and the Exodus, which marks a dramatic turning point in the history of the nation of Israel. In this context, it is interesting to note that Joseph was not only concerned with his legacy in Egypt, but with the national identity of his increasingly numerous family. By instructing his brothers to take his bones out of that land when the time came, he reiterated the awareness that Egypt was not Israel's final destination. The scriptures confirm that centuries later, during the Exodus led by Moses, that commitment was fulfilled. Joseph's death, therefore, already anticipated the cry of a people who, although in a foreign land, nurtured the hope of returning to the inheritance promised by God. Though embalmed and honored in Egypt, Joseph did not desire a permanent burial outside the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In his death, Joseph was honored as a prince of Egypt, but he was first concerned with being remembered as a son of Abraham. This reinforces the historical perspective that Israelite identity was intimately tied to the divine promise regarding the land of Canaan, a promise that spanned generations. Joseph's conviction concerning the future of the nation places him, in fact, in the hall of faith heroes in the New Testament. For the writer of Hebrews in chapter 11 says the following about him: "By faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones." Undoubtedly, the story of Joseph's death highlights God's sovereignty and the enduring faith of the patriarchs, especially at the end of their lives. Joseph represents an example of faithfulness that surpasses personal and political circumstances, as he maintained hope in the divine promises even having lived most of his life outside Canaan. Joseph's request for the removal of his bones from Egypt was directly linked to the covenantal theme. The land was the concrete symbol of the divine promise given to Abraham and reiterated to Isaac and Jacob. By desiring to have his body in the land of the covenant, Joseph reaffirmed that his true home was in God's plans for Israel, not in Egypt's fleeting glories. This act of faith elevated the certainty that the Lord would fulfill his promises to the chosen descendants. This is evidence of how God governs all things according to his plan. Nothing escapes his control, and even the evil acts of Joseph's brothers were transformed into a means of preserving the covenant people. Joseph, at the end of his days, consolidated this message by recalling divine sovereignty over both past and future events. It is true that the book of Genesis ends with Joseph's death, but the thread of the story is not broken. The book of Genesis ends pointing beyond its own narrative. As we have mentioned here in Genesis 15, God announced to Abraham that his descendants would sojourn in a foreign land where they would be afflicted, but from which they would be delivered with great wealth. Joseph's death, then, must be understood within this long-term horizon in which each stage in the patriarchs' lives served to confirm God's promises. That is why the instruction left by Joseph regarding his remains was not a secondary detail, but rather a reaffirmation of a hope whose fulfillment would only come many years later, with the emergence of Moses, the outbreak of the Exodus, and the formation of the people of Israel as a nation. Therefore, in theological terms, Joseph's death also signals the continuity of God's care for his covenant. Although the biblical narrative shifts scene afterward, moving from Egypt to the wilderness and then to Canaan, the sovereignty of the Lord remains unchanged. From this perspective, Joseph left a great legacy of faith, and his last words were the foreshadowing of the liberation promised by God to his ancestors. This even points to the theology of the New Testament, which sees the Exodus as a great redemptive act, a foreshadowing of the greater redemption accomplished by Christ. In a typological sense, just as God visited Israel to bring them out of Egypt, he visited humanity by sending his Son for the deliverance and redemption of all who believe in him. God's covenant with his people finds fulfillment in the work of Christ, but every stage of the Old Testament, including Joseph's death, prepared for this greater realization. The writer of Hebrews spoke of the patriarchs, including Joseph, as having died without first receiving the fulfillment of the promise. But all this was part of God's unfathomable purpose, who had planned something better so that with us they would be made perfect. So in summary, Joseph's death in Egypt represents an important closure to the patriarchal story in the Bible. Joseph witnessed the main events that consolidated Jacob's family in Egyptian soil. His prominent position in the palace, his reconciliation with his brothers, and the provision for the whole family show how God's plans included both physical preservation and the strengthening of the bond between Joseph and his relatives. He lived in a very respectable manner in Egypt, but such honor, however, did not divert him from the hope he nurtured in the promises of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And his final words testified to his full confidence that the divine covenant established with his forefathers would be faithfully fulfilled in Israel's future history. Although Joseph's death opened the way for the period of servitude the Israelites would face in Egypt, this transition between Genesis and Exodus is fundamental to understanding the unfolding of the great divine interventions in the books that follow. And before dying, prophetically, Joseph announced that coming deliverance, reinforcing the theme of God's sovereignty and the persistence of his promises regardless of human circumstances. Later, in Joshua chapter 24, verse 32, we read, that Joseph's bones were finally buried at Shechem, thus fulfilling the patriarch's desire. Therefore, ultimately, Joseph's death was not a tragic end, but a landmark of hope. As many commentators express, this biblical scene, though dealing with the death of an important biblical character, points to God's future intervention on behalf of his people. Thus, if anyone wonders how Joseph died in Egypt, the answer goes far beyond the simple biological record of his 110 years of life. It encompasses the unwavering faith of a man who, though exalted in foreign lands, did not forget his true identity in God, who, though honored by Egypt, did not give up being part of the covenant people, and who, at the end of his life, fully reflected the conviction that the Lord would visit his people and lead them to the promised land. Joseph rested in the assurance that the same God who had sustained him through life's adversities would also redeem his chosen nation in the future.